So there's something that I've been wanting and planning to do for a while now, but I've also been a bit hesitant to talk about this, and that is to talk more in depth about the queer representation and queer themes in the Wheel of Time. But when the latest teaser for the Wheel of Time TV show dropped, this one, this amazing one of Moraine, that's so freaking awesome. But anyway, when this teaser dropped, it was accompanied by, what appears to be tradition now, a Q&A with the showrunner, Rafe Judkins. And in among the questions was this one: any LGBT rep in the show? And Rafe responded with, there's rep in the books and in the show. Now, before I continue, my standard spoiler warning: this video is going to contain spoilers, both general and specific spoilers for the entire series. So if you haven't finished the entire series, Wheel of Time, including the prequel, New Spring, I suggest you stop now and come back when you're done. Anyway, in his response, Rafe included both the pride flag and the trans flag, which I was especially glad to see. And Rafe is, of course, right. There is LGBT rep in the books. However, and I've talked about this a bit before, I have feelings about the way queer characters are portrayed in these books. And I already know that somebody's going to comment this. These books were written in a different time, and I fully acknowledge that. And I acknowledge what I think RJ was trying to do, and I want to honor his intent. But the LGBT rep in the books is severely lacking. And I don't just mean in numbers, although that is entirely true. There is not a proportionate amount of canon queer characters. And RJ didn't include a single male queer character in his writings at all. The way queer characters are written, most of them, the often mentioned pillow friends that comes up every time this topic comes up, they are not written in a way that reads to me as truly queer. It is written more as, the phase that everybody talks about, a way to fulfill sexual needs while men are not available. In fact, it's actually rather explicitly indicated or hinted at in the narrative that this is seen as an immature version of sexuality, which is something I can tell you from personal experience is a real thing that used to be said. This was said to me multiple times, that everyone goes through a homosexual phase of attraction and gay people are stuck in this stunted sexuality. And I don't know if this is something RJ actually believed, but he included it as an explanation for pillow friends in his writings. And then there are the canon lesbians. Lesbian isn't a word that's used in this world, but the women who are shown to exclusively have attractions to other women. I was actually talking with a friend on Discord about this recently, and the way I described it, I said, his representation of lesbians reads like a man who has heard tell of lesbians via myth and legend. A metaphor I was actually particularly proud of, given the theme of myth and legend and the loss of knowledge in these books. Lesbians in the books are stern, vicious, cruel, angry women who hate men and or somehow want to be just like men. It's lesbianism as defined by its relationship to men. Like, it's not actually defined by attraction to women. It's defined by what they think about men, which puts men at the center because apparently men are the most important thing. It's nonsense. It's lacking. And it's not all that I want all representations of lesbians to be paragons of wisdom and kindness or whatever. It's just, when you, in your writings, portray all members of a specific group with a certain trait, it no longer reads like a personality trait. It reads like a bias, a prejudice, or, a stereotype at the least that you have not thoroughly thought through. And this isn't even touching on the quote-unquote trans representation in the books. And, okay, I know whenever I bring this up that people will be in the comments, there is trans representation. Halima, done. You don't have to do anything else. And no, Halima is evidence that Robert Jordan was he was ill-informed, to put it mildly, about trans people. He wrote Halima as a sort of personification of that 90s paranoia that people had about trans women. Nobody even talked about trans men at this point, but trans women. That trans women were out to trick people, specifically to trick men. It was all over media at the time. You still see it sometimes. Halima's entire story arc is about deception, and they revel in the fact that they are tricking people, often specifically tricking men. And this doesn't even address the fact that RJ seemed to think that when writing about Halima, he was writing Halima as a trans woman when he wrote them as having a male soul, as evidenced by the fact that they still channel Saidin and feel trapped and are being punished by being in a female body. Now, there are many trans people who reject the whole being born into a wrong body narrative, but this experience of a male soul in a female body is much more akin to the experience of many trans men, not trans women. The way RJ wrote Halima was, like, legit so confusing for me. I could not figure out what he was trying to do with his character until I suddenly had a moment and I just went, oh, he's got it backwards. He thinks that the body is somehow more important than the soul or the mind. All right, okay, just ignore that. I had to literally ignore it in order to make the plot make sense. So, if Halima was Robert Jordan's attempt at trans inclusion in the books, then, much like the lesbians, Halima is just a character written and created by someone who seemed to not understand the group they were trying to represent. But okay, all of that is to say that yes, there is queer representation in the books, but it is lacking, and I am hoping for more from the show. Not just numerically speaking, I am hoping for better from the show. Just more accurate, representative representation would be nice. But okay, beyond the actual queer characters in these books, I think that there are queer themes just layered throughout the story. And whether or not these were intentional, I don't think we'll ever know. But I can tell you as a queer person that there are moments and plot lines and beats in this story that resonate with me in a way that might be different from the way other people read those moments. And so that's what I want to talk about now. Queer themes in the Wheel of Time. The first moment I want to talk about is one I mentioned in my last video, the Wheel of Time TV show tag video. There was a question about what scene we were most excited to see adapted to screen. And I mentioned the scene where Nynaeve sneaks up on Lan and Moraine, and then Moraine tells Nynaeve that she can channel. Nynaeve, up until this moment, and for a long while after this moment, is mostly, a force of nature. She is loud and strong and violent, but in this conversation, we see her mask torn away from her as this very private, very secret even from herself. The secret is revealed, and she desperately wants it to not be true and asks Moraine to keep her secret. This moment hits me so hard. I've never had the experience of someone coming to me and outing me to myself, although I do have friends that has happened to. But that feeling of knowing something about yourself that you so wish wasn't true, I feel that so hard. I grew up very religious, and while it is actually very common these days for Christians to be welcoming and affirming of queer people, it was not when I was growing up. In fact, the only way that I knew words like homosexual and gay was from sermons about how evil it was and how it was a sign of the end times and whatnot. So you can imagine how much I hated this thing about myself and just wanted so hard for it to just go away. And if it wouldn't go away, then what I wanted was for just no one to ever know. So that moment where Nynaeve asks Moraine to just please not tell anyone, it hits me. And then, of course, we have Egwene, who in this regard is kind of the opposite of Nynaeve. Now, reading a queer theme into Egwene's storyline was not my idea. I actually got super lucky and got a chance to interview Ann and Matt, the hosts of the Cool Story podcast, which is a Wheel of Time new reader podcast, highly recommended, by the way. And Ann talked about seeing a queer storyline in Egwene, and in contrasting her with Nynaeve, I see it so clearly now. Nynaeve is like me, or like who I used to be. She's a person with a secret that they hide so deep that it's sometimes even a secret from themselves, and who is prepared to live a life suppressing that part of themselves. That was me for such a long time. I didn't come out until I was 25, and even then, it was very limited. 25 was when I finally accepted it for myself. But I didn't tell most people in my life. That happened slowly over the next, maybe 5 years? Egwene, on the other hand. Egwene reminds me of this guy at my high school who once wore a shirt that said, in just big, bold font across his shirt, it just said gay. And I remember this. I remember seeing it and saying to him something like, oh, that's nice. Nice that you support them or those people or whatever. I don't know. Whatever I said, it was dumb. But I assumed that he was being what nowadays we would call an ally. And he looked at me like the idiot I was and said, no, bitch, I'm gay. And when I reacted in shock, I think I just stared at him, like mouth like, and he sighed and went, yeah, that's why I can't wait to get out of here. Egwene doesn't know that she can channel until Moraine tells her that she can. But she knows right from the beginning that the Two Rivers is not enough for her. That there's something outside the Two Rivers that calls to her. It is the story of so many gay kids growing up in small towns that are just waiting to be old enough to move to the big city, to be fully who they are, and to come into their own. In that same interview, the Cool Story interview, Matt, the other host, Matt is a new reader in the Cool Story podcast. He made me see something that is so bloody obvious that I feel stupid for not having thought of it before. Perrin's storyline. For me, one of the most frustrating aspects of Perrin's storyline is how he goes back and forth about the wolves. He seems to accept them, and then he pushes them away, and then he embraces them, and then he blocks them, and then he just waffles back and forth, and it drives me crazy. Oh, well, okay, it did, until Matt talked about seeing the queer experience of having to accept yourself in Perrin's storyline. And Matt had at that point only read the first 2 books of Wheel of Time. He doesn't even know yet about Perrin going back and forth on this. But for me, it was like a lightning bolt moment, because you know how I said I came out, at least to myself, when I was 25? That was not the first time, but it was the last. The first time I remember knowing that there was something different about me was when I was 9. The first time I told somebody was my mom when I was 11, and she sent me to prayer counseling. You know that whole pray the gay away joke that people say? That's what they tried to do to me. It was awful. I pretended that it worked and went right back in the closet. But then I came out again when I was 16 for a few weeks. Got scared, went back into the closet, came out again at 19 for an entire summer, just at my job. But I got a new job, told everybody there that I was gay. It was fantastic. I felt at home in my skin for the first time in forever, but then went back to university, to my old friends, and went back into the closet. Did it again a couple of summers later, didn't stick, went back into the closet. I didn't come out until literally it was my 25th birthday. I was living in Ireland, and I was far away from my friends and family, and it was low risk, but it stuck at that point. And when I went back home, I slowly began telling people in my life. If anyone had been reading my story from the outside, I bet they would have been just like me. You know, when I'm reading Perrin's story arc and going, just accept it. Just accept that you can talk to wolves and move on. Now, when I think about this aspect of Perrin's story, I identify with it. I see myself in it. It's realistic. I mean, there are even beats in it that are just straight out of real life. If you look at the moment, for example, when he tells Ingtar, he comes out to Ingtar, the reaction he expects is rejection. You know, maybe even Ingtar will think he's a dark friend. And Ingtar doesn't actually fully reject him, but he does do that whole, okay, but they won't understand you, so you still gotta hide. Which is, it's literally almost word for word what I heard from some members of my family when I told them that, well, okay, just don't tell other people because they won't understand. Perrin's story just resonates with me different now. And then there is, for me, one of the biggest ways I see queerness in this story, and that is the ability to channel itself. Often when people talk about this, they describe it as being similar to an addiction. And I think that is an apt metaphor, but honestly, to me it reads much more like sexuality. And I don't mean that in any prurient way. I don't mean that channeling feels like sex. I mean it as a sexual orientation or a sexual drive, maybe. Now, part of this I think is actually very intentional. For example, things like female channelers sparking earlier and having a steady growth in their ability, whereas men spark later and their ability grows in spurts. That feels very deliberately analogous to puberty. But the part that feels actually most like sexuality to me is the idea that is said so many times, that once you start channeling, you will be unable to stop channeling. Now, again, I don't mean this in some sort of salacious way, once you start having sex, you can't stop, because that's nonsense. Of course you can. What it feels like to me, though, is that you cannot deny who you are. As I mentioned before, I came out many times before that final time when I was 25, but I always went back in the closet, fully determined to stay there, just to be a good straight girl. And I tried. Believe me, I tried. So freaking hard. But once I had experienced being out of the closet, being back in the closet was awful. It was just awful. Even after having horrible reactions to coming out, it was too uncomfortable to be lying to everyone and lying to myself. It was impossible. to live like that. And then there's the way that people react to being gentled or stilled. They lose their will to live. Again, this has always felt depressingly familiar to me. When you deny such a central part of who you are, it mutes the world. Like, for me anyway, nothing felt as real or as tangible because so much of my energy and just so much of who I was, so much of myself was focused on just pushing this one thing down and hiding it. I did not have energy to enjoy the rest of my life. I actually remember describing it to one of my pastors when I came out to her, that what I felt like was that my whole life I had been swimming upstream and I was exhausted and I hadn't gotten anywhere. But coming out felt like turning around and swimming with the current for the first time. And I actually could finally look around and see the beauty of the world. And all I could think at that time was, why the hell have I been swimming that way all this time? I wasn't getting anywhere. It was just wearing me out. So when I see Loghain wandering around the tower grounds and being dejected and empty, this resonates with me. Now, I never had my sexuality removed like Loghain with his ability to channel, despite what those prayer counselors tried to do, but tamping it down and trying to remove it myself, I understand what Loghain is feeling. And then there's Rand. Now, as I said in my last video, the Wheel of Time TV show tag video, I honestly just don't think about Rand all that much. I know that's weird. In many people's minds, he is the main character, but I don't find him all that interesting. I like him, but he is more plot than character to me. But it is impossible to talk about queer themes in these books and ignore this aspect of his storyline. Rand, much like Perrin, has this part of himself that he wants to reject and to hide. But unlike Perrin, who at times seems to have a choice, Rand doesn't. He cannot reject his ability to channel. As someone born with a spark, it's going to happen. And because of who he is, he can't hide it. He's the Dragon Reborn. And he knows, or at least he fears, that his ability, this thing about him that makes him different, is going to inevitably lead to death and destruction. And that's even aside from him being the Dragon Reborn. Men who can channel, if they aren't gentled, they kill people around them, and they rot to death. This very much mirrors the experience that I remember of living through the AIDS epidemic, that stigma that people living with HIV and AIDS had at the time, and in many places still do. This fear that they, just by existing, will cause harm to those around them, and then will eventually die in a very undignified way. Now, all of the queer themes that I've mentioned previously, I actually don't think that they were intentional on Robert Jordan's part. I do think I'm reading into the books, but everybody does that. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. This parallel to the HIV/AIDS crisis that we saw in the 80s and 90s, I think this is intentional. The parallel is almost too perfect to be accidental, especially given the time that these books were started and written, and the fact that the taint and the taint sickness is very gender specific. And at this time in history, HIV and AIDS was, at least it was perceived to be, a very much a gay male disease. While I may criticize Robert Jordan's portrayal of queer characters, which I do think was born more out of ignorance rather than malice, I also always say that I want to honor his intent. And in this story, in this aspect of Rand's story, I see that good intent. That he was trying to explore a character who, through no fault of their own, finds themselves, quote-unquote, infected with something that everyone fears and no one understands. And no one can help him. He can't find information about it. He has to figure everything out on his own. And I think in light of this interpretation of this aspect of Rand's storyline, that it is beautiful and hopeful that part of Rand's story includes the cleansing of the taint and the ultimate acceptance of male channelers. Phew, all right, I've talked long enough, so I'm just going to end this here. Let me know what you think, and what moments resonated with you, maybe that are unique to your life experience that maybe other people don't see. Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to talk about it further, you can always join my Discord, which will be linked below. And if you want to support me and my channel, you can always check out my Patreon, again, linked below. I also have merch now, which you can check out in my merch stores, which, shockingly, also in the description below. And with that, I'll end this. As always, like, subscribe, and stick around for the art credits. Bye!